Tonight we begin the story of a medieval princess. Not the fairy tales of castles and happily ever after, but the real life of duty, isolation, and sacrifice that came with being born into royalty. From childhood to her final days, we'll walk gently through her world, seeing how every step of her life was shaped not by choice, but by the expectations of her crown. If you enjoy these calming journeys through history, remember to subscribe to The Boring Historian. Before you drift off to sleep, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? The bells of the great cathedral rang across the cold stone city, echoing against towers and market squares. A royal messenger mounted high on a weary horse carried the news through the narrow streets. The queen had given birth. Then the walls of the castle, where tapestries muffled the winter chill, attendants bustled with the kind of hurried reverence that only came when an heir, or in this case, princess, was brought into the world. The child was wrapped not in the soft comforts of her mother's arms, but in cloths chosen carefully for ceremony. Her tiny cries, fragile as they were immediately recorded by priests and courtiers alike. For even in infancy, her existence was political. She was no ordinary child. She was a princess, and from the very moment of her first breath, her life belonged not to herself, nor even to her family, but to the expectations of her crown. Outside the castle, the people of the realm lit candles in doorways and offered prayers of gratitude. They cheered in the taverns, raising mugs of ale in honor of their sovereign's newest child. Some whispered disappointment that she was not a boy, not the sturdy heir who would inherit armor and crown. But still, royal birth was cause for celebration. Farmers in distant villages spoke her name as though it were already woven into their destiny, a symbol of stability and blessing. Inside, however, the mood was more complex. Her mother, pale and weakened from the ordeal of childbirth, was given only the briefest moments to hold her daughter, before the infant was taken away into the hands of wet nurses and ladies-in-waiting. The king, seated high on his carved oak throne, listened to the announcement with a stoic face. He nodded at the priests, who blessed the child, and ordered the scribes to record the exact hour of her birth. For even the stars under which she was born would be used to predict her fate. This little girl, still fragile and unaware of the vast stage into which she had been placed, was already burdened by duty. If her father was pleased, it was only in the sense that she was another piece upon the great chessboard of kingdoms and dynasties. A daughter could be married, exchanged, or bargained. Her life, her very body, a means of sealing alliances. From her very first day, she was less a child than a promise. Her nursery was not the warm, colorful room of modern childhood, but a chamber of cold stone softened only by embroidered hangings. Cradles carved with lions and angels surrounded her, and nurses murmured prayers as they swaddled her in cloth dyed with costly threads. Outside her door, guards kept watch. Already her life was measured in ceremony and guarded by swords. The people of the court whispered about her future. Some imagined she would one day wed a foreign prince, carrying her dowry and her name across mountains and seas to strengthen ties between kingdoms. Others speculated that she might be sent to a convent if her marriage prospects faltered, living out her days in silent prayer. Whatever her fate, it was certain that she would never choose it. And so, the princess grew from her first days in the quiet knowledge, though she could not yet understand it, that she was not free. Her smiles, her tears, her very existence were watched, weighed, and noted by those who saw her not as a child, but as an instrument of destiny. Even in her cradle, courtiers studied her tiny features, wondering aloud whose eyes she had inherited, whether her jaw was strong enough to suggest a proud lineage, whether she might one day bear sons. Her first moments of life were celebrated with feasts in the great hall. Candles dripped onto silver plates, musicians played soft lutes, and nobles drank to her health. Yet as the wine flowed, so too did the murmurs. Would the king try again for another son? Would this daughter be valuable enough to secure a marriage across the sea? She was praised as a blessing, yet always with the silent reminder that she was not what the realm most desired. And so the story begins, not in fairy tale wonder, but in duty. A princess born into a world where her every breath would be shaped by expectation. She was celebrated, yes, but she was also claimed by a family, by a court, by a kingdom that would never let her simply be herself. Her cradle rocked gently by the firelight. She drifted to sleep, unaware of the weight she carried already. Outside her chamber, snow fell on the castle walls, silent and cold, while the bells still echoed faintly across the land. A princess was born. The first memories of her life were not of freedom, but of walls. Gray stone walls that loomed over her like watchful sentinels, pressing in on every moment of her childhood. The princess grew within a castle that was both her protection and her prison. Her nursery was moved into the upper chambers of a tower, away from the noise of soldiers' drills in the courtyard below, away from the scent of smoke and iron from the kitchens. She was surrounded by women who cared for her every need. Nurses, ladies, waiting, and governesses. Yet she hardly knew the touch of her mother, whose duties to the court and the realm often kept her distant. Her father, the king, was an even rarer sight, appearing only in formal settings, looking upon her with a kind of distant curiosity rather than the tenderness of a parent. As a child, she learned quickly that her life was not her own. Play was permitted only in small doses and in carefully chosen spaces, never in the mud of the courtyards, never among the common children in the villages that dotted the countryside beyond the castle gates. Her toys were carved wooden figures, delicate embroidery hoops, and illuminated prayer books. When she laughed too loudly, she was hushed. When she ran too freely, she was reminded of her station. Always, she was being molded, shaped into something she could not yet understand. The castle was her entire world. She gazed out from narrow windows set deep into stone walls, seeing only a patch of sky, a sliver of forest, or the faint ribbon of a road stretching away to places she would never visit as a child. The drawbridge was raised and lowered for knights and messengers, but never for her. The few gardens she could walk in were enclosed by high walls, guarded at every turn. It was a strange kind of gilded captivity, where she was sheltered from danger, yet equally sheltered from joy. Her tutors arrived early in her childhood, their presence as constant as the ticking of an invisible clock. A stern priest taught her to read and write in Latin, the language of scripture and law. Another guided her through the holy texts, ensuring her prayers were recited perfectly, her posture properly reverent. A court lady instructed her in needlework, reminding her again and again that a princess's hands must be graceful, her stitches even, her patience endless. Music followed the plucking of harp strings, the careful pressing of fingers upon ivory keys. While boys of noble birth were trained to hunt, to ride, to wield sword and lance, she was taught to sit, to bow, to pour wine without spilling a drop. She was told to hold her tongue, to keep her eyes lowered, to smile without revealing too much of herself. These lessons did not end when the day was over. They were woven into every moment of her life, into every correction made by watchful eyes around her. At night, when the castle grew quiet and the fires in the great hall burned low, she sometimes crept to the narrow window of her chamber. There she pressed her small face against the cold glass and looked out at the dark world beyond. She could see torchlight flickering from the village below, hear faint laughter carried on the wind from the taverns, where peasants sang songs of harvest and home. She wondered what it might be like to sit at one of those wooden tables, to feel the warmth of a simple hearth, to be a child without walls around her. But the drawbridge remained closed, and her world remained stone and silence. As she grew older, she began to understand that her life was not meant for her own happiness. The whispers of the court reminded her of this constantly. A noble visitor would remark, "She grows tall. She will be a fine bride for some prince abroad." A lady-in-waiting would murmur, "Her eyes are her mother's, her chin her father's. Perhaps she will bring favor to our land." She heard these things often enough that they became part of her very sense of self. She was not just a girl. She was a promise yet to be fulfilled. Sometimes, when her governess left her unattended, she would imagine herself escaping. She would trace the lines of the stone walls with her fingers, wondering if there might be a hidden passage that led outside. She dreamed of running barefoot through grass, of climbing trees, of laughing without being hushed. But such dreams were fleeting, quickly replaced by the sound of the chapel bells or the stern voice of a tutor reminding her of her duties. Her childhood, though filled with lessons and order, was a lonely one. She had siblings, perhaps brothers sent off to be trained as knights, perhaps sisters already spoken for in marriage contracts, yet even among them, rank and duty drew invisible lines. She could not simply play freely with them, for each was being raised as carefully and deliberately as she was, each destined for roles none of them had chosen. By the time she reached her 10th year, the princess had learned to hide her feelings behind a practiced smile. She knew how to sit for long hours in silence, how to curtsy with elegance, how to repeat prayers without her mind wandering. But beneath the surface, the loneliness weighed on her. The castle walls that had once seemed merely tall now felt like a cage, each stone another reminder of the life she had not chosen. And so her childhood passed, not in the carefree laughter of innocence, but in carefully measured steps across polished floors, in whispered lessons under candlelight, in the watchful gaze of those who shaped her every movement. She was a princess, safe, protected, revered. But she was also a prisoner, bound to a fate that was written long before she had even learned to read. The castle bells marked the passing of each day, and with every chime the young princess was reminded that her life belonged not to play or freedom, but to discipline. Her lessons in obedience had already begun. Her mornings were not her own. At dawn, she was woken by her governess, her hair brushed and braided, her gown pulled into place. She was led to the chapel for prayers, her small voice expected to rise in unison with the adults around her, though she could hardly understand the Latin words on her lips. From there, the day unfolded in rigid order, each hour dedicated to shaping her into something silent, graceful, and useful to the ambitions of her family. She was taught to sit without fidgeting, to lower her eyes in the presence of men, to fold her hands neatly upon her lap. A princess, they reminded her, must not speak out of turn. She must not question, nor argue, nor raise her voice above a gentle murmur. Her opinions mattered little, but her silence mattered greatly. For silence was the language of obedience, and obedience was the foundation of her life. Her governess corrected even the smallest movements. If she slouched, she was made to balance a book on her head, walking slowly across the chamber until her posture was straight and unyielding. If she giggled too freely, she was reminded that laughter must be delicate, never uncontrolled. If she hesitated in answering a tutor's question, she was chided for weakness. Told that hesitation was unbecoming of one destined to stand at the side of kings, meals became lessons too. She learned to take bread with her fingertips, to sip from a goblet without leaving a trace upon its rim, to eat slowly and quietly no matter her hunger. A princess's table manners, she was told, spoke as loudly as her words, even at her most basic needs. She was never free of the lessons being carved into her. In the afternoons, she was guided through embroidery, her small fingers pricked by needles until she mastered the art of weaving delicate patterns into cloth. Patience, her tutor whispered. A princess must show patience. When her stitches went astray, the work was undone and forced to begin again until her hands learned the rhythm of perfection. It was not truly the cloth that mattered, but the lesson beneath it, that her life would be one of quiet endurance, of accepting repetition, of finding dignity in silence. As she grew, she was taught not only obedience to her family, but obedience to her role in the wider world. Tutors lectured her on the duties of a wife, though she was still a child. They reminded her that her body was not her own, that one day it would be her responsibility to carry heirs for whatever prince or king she was given to. Your worth, one stern lady-in-waiting told her, will be measured by your grace, your silence, and the sons you give your husband. The words sank deep into her memory, not fully understood then, but carried like a weight in her heart. In her rare moments of solitude, she would sometimes rebel in small ways. She might hum a tune too loudly when no one listened. Or she might allow herself to run across the chamber with unladylike speed before her footsteps were heard and scolded. She found tiny escapes in her imagination, pretending the tapestries were forests she could vanish into, or that the carved wooden beams above her bed were ladders to the sky. But always the walls returned. Always the eyes of her keepers reminded her that she was not to be wild, not to be free. By the time she reached her 12th year, she had become adept at masking her thoughts. She had learned the art of speaking without saying anything, of smiling without revealing her true feelings, of listening without letting her mind wander too far. These skills, her tutors praised, were not trivial. They were the very tools of survival in courts, where every word could be twisted, every expression misunderstood. She was being shaped into a vessel of diplomacy, someone who could endure long silences, who could smile in the face of insult, who could hold her tongue when she longed to speak. But this obedience came at a cost. With each lesson, a part of her spirit seemed to grow quieter. The carefree laughter of childhood faded into a practiced smile. The boldness of her questions dulled into careful silence. She was not beaten or starved, not punished cruelly as peasants' children might be, but in its own way. The strict shaping of her life was its own cage, carving away the pieces of herself that might have bloomed into something freer. And so, step by step, she was transformed. From the outside, she seemed the very image of a dutiful young princess, graceful, patient, silent, but inside, her heart whispered for something more, even if she had no name for it yet. She was learning to play the role expected of her, a role that would follow her into the years ahead, where silence, grace, and obedience would be not just lessons, but the very tools of her survival. The castle was never silent, yet for the young princess, it always felt empty. The sounds of life echoed around her, the clatter of guards, boots on stone, the ringing of hammers from the smithy, the chatter of kitchen servants, the barking of hounds in the yard. But these sounds belonged to a world she was not allowed to touch. She was surrounded by people, yet she was alone. Her governess told her that royal children must never mix with common ones. "It is beneath you," she would say sternly, whenever the princess looked longingly from the windows at the children running freely in the village below. Those children played without tutors, laughed without restraint, and tumbled into the mud without fear of scolding. Their games were loud, chaotic, and full of life. She watched them sometimes until her eyes blurred with tears. Her hands pressed against the cold stone sill, wishing she might slip from the tower and join them, even for a single hour. Within the castle, the only children near her age were her siblings, yet even there, invisible barriers divided them. If she had brothers, they were separated early, taken under the watch of knights and tutors to prepare them for battle and command. Their days were filled with the clashing of wooden swords and the thunder of hooves in the training yard. She caught glimpses of them now and then, their laughter bold, their limbs bruised from boyish roughness. But they belonged to a world she was forbidden to join. Her sisters, if she had any, were both companions and rivals. Though they shared the same nursery once, their futures were charted differently depending on age and promise. An elder sister was already whispered about as a potential bride for a powerful lord, praised for her beauty or her composure. A younger sister was treated with less expectation for now, but her lessons in obedience loomed ahead. Between them, competition simmered quietly. Whose embroidery was neatest, its posture most graceful, whose manners most praised by the governess. Though they loved each other in the way siblings do, they were each reminded daily that they were being groomed for different roles, each compared against the other like jewels weighed for their worth. And so, the princess found herself without true companionship. Every smile she gave, every word she spoke was measured. She could not confide freely in her governess, for every secret might one day be repeated to the queen. She could not laugh without restraint with her sisters, for laughter too easily turned to judgment. She could not run and wrestle with her brothers, for her gowns and lessons bound her tightly. The very walls seemed to echo back her longing, each corridor a reminder of her solitude. In the long afternoons, when the light slanted through arrow-slit windows and painted the floors in narrow beams, she would sit with her embroidery or prayer book, while the women around her murmured. Their voices were low, discussing politics, alliances, or rumors of the court. She was present, but not included. A child, yet also a vessel of duty, she was expected to listen quietly, to learn through silence. It was during these moments that loneliness weighed heaviest upon her, for though she was surrounded by attendants, none were allowed to become friends. A princess, they reminded her, could not be familiar with servants. Affection blurred the lines of authority. And so even the nurse, who had cradled her as an infant, who might have whispered songs into her ears at night, eventually withdrew into formal distance, bowing when she entered, addressing her as my lady instead of my child. The days blended into one another, predictable and ordered. Lessons, prayers, embroidery, meals, silence. The seasons changed outside. Summer fields golden with grain. Autumn leaves blazing red. Winter snows burying the village below. But within the castle, her world barely shifted. She came to know every stone in the walls, every pattern in the tapestries, every crack in the flagstones beneath her slippers. Time was measured not by joy or adventure, but by the slow rhythm of bells and duties. Sometimes on feast days, the great hall was filled with music and laughter. Nobles gathered, torches blazed, minstrels sang. She would sit among the other children of the court, dressed in silks that itched against her skin, watching the dancers whirl. And though she smiled politely, the joy of others only deepened her solitude. She did not belong among the adults, nor truly among the children. She was always watched, always measured, always alone. In those rare moments when her father, the king, noticed her, he might pat her head gently or offer a brief smile. But his affection was distant, formal, as though she were one of many tasks to be acknowledged. Her mother, the queen, spoke to her more often, yet even those words were measured. "Stand tall," she would say, "do not frown." Or more heavily, "You are not your own daughter. You are the kingdom's." And with those words, the princess felt the weight of her solitude deepen, for she realized she could never truly be simply herself. Thus her childhood unfolded, not in carefree laughter, but in a quiet isolation that wrapped itself around her like a cloak. She had attendants but no friends, siblings but no companions, family but little warmth. She was surrounded by splendor, yet starved of freedom. Though she could not yet name it, she was already learning that her life as a princess, so admired from the outside, was in truth a lonely prison of privilege. From the moment she could walk, her future was already spoken of in hushed tones across the stone corridors of the castle. While other children might dream of who they would one day marry, the medieval princess never had such freedom. Her hand was not her own to give. It was a tool, a bridge between kingdoms, a signature on a treaty, a means to bind allies and silence enemies. Even as a child, she would overhear fragments of conversations, courtiers whispering of princes she had never met, dukes. She would never see kings across the sea who viewed her not as a girl, but as a bargaining chip. Her dolls were dressed in fine silks, but they were less toys and more rehearsals for the gowns she would one day wear at another court. Every embroidered stitch on her clothes reminded her that she was being prepared for display, like a jewel polished for someone else's crown. At meals, she was gently reminded to eat modestly, to smile but not too widely, to speak softly but with intelligence. Every gesture mattered, for one day these little details would be judged by strangers who held her fate in their hands. The whispers of marriage were constant, like a background hum in her daily life. While she was still learning her letters and prayers, men twice her age already saw her as a prize to be won. Sometimes, when she stared out through the high castle windows, she wondered if the girls in the village below also felt this kind of weight. Did they too have their futures mapped out before they understood what marriage even meant? But deep down she knew her life was different. Their choices were limited by survival, hers by politics. Both were cages, though hers was gilded. The princess may not yet have understood the full meaning of duty, but already the shadow of her wedding veil loomed over her. A veil not chosen for love, but for the survival of her dynasty. The day finally came when the whispers of marriage turned into action. The decision had been made for her, signed and sealed, long before she was ready to leave the safety of her childhood world. She was to wed a man she had never met, in a kingdom she had never seen, to secure a bond that would strengthen her father's throne. For the princess, there was no room for argument. Duty was not asked of her, it was demanded. Her chambers, once filled with the familiar comfort of tutors, ladies-in-waiting, and the soft patterns of her daily routine became a place of packing and departure. Gowns folded, jewels counted, personal trinkets wrapped away. Even the dolls of her childhood were carefully boxed, not because she would play with them, but because they would remind her of who she had been before she became a wife. The corridors of the castle seemed suddenly narrower, each echo of her footsteps carrying the knowledge that she would soon walk them no more. The morning of her departure was shrouded in ritual. Blessings were spoken, gifts were pressed into her hands. and courtiers wept with the kind of rehearsed sadness that came more from politics than affection. But her heart was heavy.
Oh.
For though she was praised as a symbol of alliance, she felt herself fading into a role that had been scripted long before her birth. When the great doors of the castle closed behind her, she looked back only once. The towers, gray against the morning sky, had been her entire world. Beyond them stretched a road leading into uncertainty. Ahead lay weeks of travel, across muddy paths, thick forests, and perhaps even stormy seas. The journey itself was another kind of test. She was no longer a girl tucked safely behind castle walls. She was a bride in transit, watched by guards, priests, and attendants, who treated her less like a person and more like a symbol. They were responsible for delivering intact. The carriages rattled endlessly, the air thick with the smell of horses, leather, and damp earth. At night, in strange inns or cold tents, she lay awake, staring into the dark. She thought of her mother's face, of her siblings she might never see again, of the gardens she once walked in freely. The lullabies of her childhood were replaced by the mutterings of soldiers and the crackling of campfires. As the borders of her homeland disappeared behind her, she felt the last threads of familiarity unravel. Every mile carried her farther from the only life she had ever known. Ahead lay a foreign land, a foreign court, and a husband who was to her still a stranger. Her name, her body, her very presence, all had been traded away for a promise of peace and power. The medieval princess leaving home was not a step into adulthood, but a surrender. It was the moment she truly understood that her life did not belong to her. It belonged to the crown, to alliances, to history.
Oh.
And as the wheels of her carriage turned endlessly onward, she whispered silent prayers to herself. Not for happiness, for she knew better than to expect that, but for strength enough to endure. When the princess finally arrived at her husband's court, she might have expected a warm welcome. Songs, processions, or perhaps even the smile of the man she was bound to marry. But what greeted her instead was strangeness. The air itself felt different, carrying accents and words she could barely understand. The castle towers rose against the sky in a shape unfamiliar to her eyes, their banners colored with emblems she had only ever seen stitched onto her dowry chest. Here, every glance lingered too long. Every whisper seemed to carry her name. She was not just a bride, she was an outsider, a foreigner brought in to bind two kingdoms. Some welcomed her, bowing low and offering gifts with polished courtesy. But beneath the smiles there was unease. She was the symbol of an alliance, yes, but also a reminder of foreign influence. In the minds of many, her loyalties would always belong to her father's court, not her husband's. Her days became a blur of lessons. She was expected to learn a new language swiftly, not merely to converse politely, but to speak with the grace of a quintaby. Every mistake, every misplaced syllable, was met with raised brows and muffled laughter. She studied customs, manners, and rituals that felt strange to her hands and tongue. Even at the dinner table she felt adrift, unsure of when to speak, when to remain silent, and which foods to accept or decline. In her husband's household, trust was scarce. Ladies-in-waiting assigned to her were as much spies as companions, watching what she ate, what she read, and to whom she spoke. Gifts sent to her chambers were sometimes laced with subtle meanings, a necklace heavy with symbols of fertility, a prayer book hinting at expectations of piety, a cloak sewn with her new family's crest, as if to erase the identity she had brought with her. Her husband, though polite, was distant. He had grown up in this place, steeped in its traditions, and she was little more than a stranger thrust into his world. They spoke carefully, with words chosen more for duty than affection. The gap between them was more than language. It was the weight of two lives pressed together by the will of others. At night, as the halls grew quiet, she lay awake in her unfamiliar chambers. The tapestries on the walls showed battles and victories she did not share. The lull of distant bells was foreign, carrying no comfort from her homeland. Even the air through the narrow window carried scents of spices and wood smoke she had never known. Everything reminded her she did not belong. To survive in this new court, the princess learned the art of silence. She nodded when expected, smiled when required, and listened far more than she spoke. Each day she put on her gown as if it were armor, stepping carefully through a world where every word might be twisted, every glance misread. Slowly, she began to understand that her survival depended not only on grace, but on caution. In time, the princess would grow accustomed to the language, the customs, even the suspicion. But she would never forget the feeling of those first weeks, of being a guest in her own life, a foreigner in the place that was now meant to be her home. The princess soon discovered that her new life was not her own. In her homeland, she had felt the weight of expectation. But here, in her husband's court, she became something else entirely. A piece on a vast political board, her every step calculated, her every word examined for meaning. Her presence at court was not just symbolic, it was strategic. When she entered the great hall, she knew eyes followed her, noble families gauging her expression. Foreign envoys noting her gestures, even her husband's advisors, watching to see how well she adapted to her new role. If she smiled too warmly at a visiting ambassador, whispers spread that she favored his kingdom. If she frowned at a feast, rumors grew that she was discontent, perhaps even plotting. Letters she sent home were inspected. Gifts she gave were questioned for hidden meaning. Even the way she dressed could shift alliances. A gown in the colors of her homeland might be seen as loyalty to her father rather than her husband. A gown stitched in the emblem of her new family might draw scorn from those who doubted her sincerity. She was not merely dressing herself. She was negotiating politics in silk and thread. Her conversations became performances. When courtiers asked her opinion, she learned to answer with words that revealed nothing but seemed pleasing to everyone. A wrong word could anger a faction, and anger could lead to dangerous consequences. Even friendships were dangerous. To favor one lady in waiting too strongly meant offending another noble family. To confide in anyone risked betrayal, for secrets were traded as eagerly as coins. At times, she felt less like a wife or daughter than a living treaty. Her value was measured not in her laughter, or her thoughts, or her dreams, but in her ability to produce heirs to host with elegance. To keep her household free of scandal, and to embody the fragile link between two kingdoms. If she succeeded, she was praised as wise and gracious. If she faltered, she was blamed for weakness, disloyalty, or worse. In the quiet of her chamber, she sometimes stood before the mirror and searched her own face, wondering where the girl she once was had gone. Did she still exist beneath the careful smiles, the restrained gestures, the endless calculations of survival? Or had she become only what others demanded? A vessel of peace, a symbol of obedience, a pawn moved by hands far more powerful than her own? For the medieval princess, power was never hers to wield, was only ever reflected upon her, borrowed for others' use. And so she lived under constant watch, her life a balance of silence, grace, and quiet endurance. Always aware that even the smallest misstep could ripple through kingdoms. Of all the expectations placed upon the medieval princess, none weighed heavier than the duty to produce an heir. From the moment her marriage was sealed, her body was no longer her own. It became the vessel through which dynasties survived, wars were prevented, and bloodlines secured. Courtiers did not speak of her in terms of her wit or kindness, but in whispers about her health, her fertility, and the strength of her womb. Every month became a cycle of quiet dread. When her courses arrived, she could feel the disappointment ripple through the household, hushed voices in corridors, pitying looks from attendants, and subtle signs of impatience from her husband. When her body did not bleed, the court stirred with anticipation, waiting for the announcement of a pregnancy that might secure the future of the realm. Her belly was no longer her own private concern. It was watched, measured, and speculated upon by an entire kingdom. Pregnancy, when it came, was both blessing and burden. She was paraded as a symbol of hope, congratulated by those who just weeks earlier had doubted her. Yet behind the smiles lurked an unspoken truth. Childbirth was perilous. Even queens, surrounded by the best midwives and physicians, were not spared the dangers of fever, bleeding, or death in labor. For every noblewoman who bore a healthy son, another was buried after childbirth, remembered only for the heirs she left behind. The pressure to produce not just children, but sons, made the burden heavier still. Daughters could be married off to form alliances, yes, but only sons secured the throne. If she bore girls, her worth was questioned, her prayers unending. Some whispered that it was her fault, her weakness, her failing as a wife and princess. In truth, it was chance and nature. But in a world where women were rarely seen beyond their roles as mothers, value was reduced to the sex of the child she bore. The chambers where she labored were places of agony and hope entwined. Curtains drawn tight, incense burning, midwives bustling, priests standing by with holy water. Screams were muffled into pillows so as not to disturb the dignity of the court outside. Her body tore and bled, and yet her cries were less her own than the cries of a kingdom demanding its heir. And if the child was lost, whether by miscarriage or stillbirth, her grief was not hers to carry in silence. It was judged, measured, turned into whispers of whether she would ever succeed in her duty. Each pregnancy aged her, wore her thin, and drained her spirit. But there was no respite. Even if she survived childbirth, her body was expected to recover quickly enough to try again. A healthy son brought temporary peace, but until the line of succession was secure, her body remained under the kingdom's relentless demand. In the lonely hours, she wondered if her mother had felt the same fear, the same exhaustion, same quiet terror each time life quickened within her. She prayed that her daughters, if she had them, might one day escape this endless cycle of being measured, not for their souls, but for their ability to carry life. The medieval princess, childbirth was not a moment of joy alone. It was survival. Survival for her, survival for her dynasty, survival for the fragile peace that rested on her womb. Every cry of a newborn child echoed with the weight of kingdoms, and every silence after labor carried the shadow of mourning, both personal and political. Life in a medieval court was never peaceful for long. Beneath the glitter of banquets and the solemnity of ceremonies, the air was thick with rivalries and whispers of betrayal. For a princess who had already sacrificed her childhood, her home, and her body to the demands of dynasties, there was yet another weight to bear, surviving the endless currents of politics swirling around her. Everywhere she turned, there were factions. The ladies-in-waiting assigned to her were not only companions, but also representatives of powerful families. Each gesture of kindness she showed to one risked the jealousy of another. If she shared laughter too often with one courtier, rumors of favoritism spread. If she turned away from another, whispers of disdain grew. The princess quickly learned that even the smallest act, a smile at a feast, a gift of fabric, a private word spoken in passing, could tilt the balance of power. Her rivals were not only outside her chambers, sometimes they lived within them. Other noble women at court, ambitious and clever, saw her not as a queen in waiting, but as an obstacle or opportunity. Some whispered of replacing her with another bride should she fail to produce a son. Others tried to befriend her, but only to gain influence, secrets, or proximity to the throne. She walked her halls as if they were battlefields, where smiles masked daggers and loyalty could vanish overnight. Jealousy simmered constantly. If she dressed in jewels too fine, she was accused of vanity. If she wore gowns too modest, she was mocked for weakness. If her husband's eyes lingered on her too long, she was the subject of envy. If he ignored her, she was pitied and ridiculed. In a world where perception meant survival, every expression of hers was a performance under scrutiny. Then came betrayal, quiet, sharp, and always near. Trusted servants passed her words to advisors. Allies who swore loyalty in private shifted allegiance in public. Even her letters to her family might never reach their destination, intercepted by hands eager to twist her words into proof of disloyalty. More than once, she discovered that her most private thoughts had become fodder for court gossip. Court intrigue was a constant game of survival. Alliances formed in the morning could collapse by nightfall. A rumor whispered in the ear of the king could end a noble family's fortune or elevate another overnight. To live in this world was to tread carefully through a maze of ambition, where one wrong step could bring ruin. For the princess, the greatest danger was that she was never truly safe. Every rival she made could one day be the hand that guided her downfall. Every friendship risked becoming a weapon turned against her. She could trust no one fully, not even her own attendants, not even her husband, whose loyalty lay first with his throne and only second with her. And so, she learned to survive not with power of her own, but with caution. She spoke less, watched more, and cultivated an air of calm dignity that revealed little. She smiled in public, even when her heart was heavy. She praised her rivals when they least expected it, keeping them uncertain of her true feelings. She learned that in the dangerous theater of royal politics, mystery itself was a shield. But at night, alone in her chambers, the weight of it all pressed heavily upon her. To be a princess in such a world was to live with constant fear, not of swords on a battlefield, but of poisoned cups, whispered lies and betrayal wrapped in silk. Her life was not the fairy tale of song and story, but a daily balancing act on the edge of danger, with no choice but to endure. From the outside, the life of a medieval princess seemed dazzling. She sat at the king's side during feasts, her gowns glittering with pearls and gold thread. She moved through candlelit halls as musicians played and courtiers bowed. She spoke with ambassadors, received noble women, and presided over ceremonies that placed her at the very heart of the kingdom's stage. To those who watched, she appeared powerful, almost queenly in her grace. Yet beneath the layers of silk and ritual, she knew the truth. Her power was more illusion than reality. She could speak, but her words were only heard when they served the interests of men who ruled around her. She could suggest, but her suggestions were only remembered if they echoed the desires of her husband or his advisors. She could smile, but her smile was a mask, crafted not for herself, but for the politics of the court. Even her moments of apparent influence were carefully measured. If she interceded for a nobleman accused of wrongdoing, her kindness was praised, but only so long as it did not conflict with the king's judgment. If she offered charity to the poor, her generosity was admired, but always attributed to the benevolence of her husband. Her influence was borrowed light, like the moon reflecting the sun. Without the king's approval, she could not shine. The decisions that shaped her life were made in rooms where she was rarely allowed to sit. Councils of men debated wars, treaties, and laws, while she remained in her chambers, waiting to be told what the outcome would mean for her. Would she be sent as an emissary to represent the crown? Would her children be promised in marriage to foreign rulers? Would she herself be uprooted once more if the winds of politics shifted? She was never consulted. She was only informed. Even in her private life, choice was scarce. Her household was appointed by others, her servants chosen as much to watch her as to serve her. Her children's tutors were selected by the court, ensuring that their loyalties remained with the throne rather than their mother. Even her daily routine, when to pray, when to walk, when to appear in public, was dictated by the needs of ceremony and politics. To outsiders, she was a woman of influence. To herself, she often felt like a figure in a grand tapestry, stitched into a role she could not escape. She could not decide the design, nor choose the colors. She could only exist within the pattern woven by others' hands. At times, she dreamed of what life might have been, had she been born. A peasant girl free to marry whom she wished, to walk where she pleased, to raise her children without fear of dynasties collapsing upon their shoulders. It was a life of hardship, yes, but at least it was lived by choice. In contrast, her own gilded life often felt like a prison, walls not of stone, but of expectation. The illusion of power was perhaps the cruelest part of being a medieval princess. To the world, she appeared to hold influence, respect, and authority. But in truth, her life was shaped almost entirely by the decisions of others. Her father, her husband's advisors, and the endless machinery of politics that turned without her voice. She was a figurehead, a symbol, a jewel in the crown of her dynasty. But rarely, if ever, was she truly free. Behind the grand tapestries and polished stone walls, where the court saw only jewels and smiles, the princess carried sorrows that no crown could shield her from. Her public life was a performance, but in private, she bore the pain of losses that cut deeper than any political betrayal. Childbirth, already a trial of survival, too often ended in grief. There were children who never took their first breath, their tiny cries swallowed by silence. There were infants who lived only a handful of days, slipping away in her arms before she could even memorize their faces. And there were sons and daughters carried to the grave in their earliest years, claimed by fever, by coughing sickness, or by the frailty of life in a world without medicine strong enough to save them. Each time, the court mourned politely, but their sorrow was thin. To them, it was not a child lost, but an heir lost, a political hope extinguished. When condolences were offered, they spoke of the need to try again, of the importance of dynastic survival. Few looked at her as a grieving mother, hollowed by absence. They saw only a womb that must be filled once more. At night, in the silence of her chambers, she wept for her children as only a mother could. She remembered the weight of their tiny bodies, the softness of their hair, the curve of their fingers. She remembered the lullabies whispered into the darkness, songs that would never be sung again. The court forgot quickly, moving on to its intrigues and banquets. But she carried her grief with her always, hidden behind the mask of duty. Her sorrows did not end with motherhood. Betrayal found her too, creeping into her marriage. Her husband, distant even in the best of times, often sought comfort elsewhere in the arms of courtesans, or the favor of ambitious noblewomen eager to capture his attention. Princess was expected to endure it silently. To complain was weakness. To protest was disloyalty. Her heart ached with jealousy, with humiliation, with the quiet despair of knowing that even within her marriage, she was little more than a vessel of alliance, not a partner in love. Rumors of his infidelities drifted through the corridors like smoke, reaching her ears no matter how hard she tried to avoid them. Sometimes the whispers were cruel, mocking her inability to keep his affection. Sometimes they were laced with pity, suggesting she had failed in her most basic duty, to hold his loyalty through obedience and charm. The weight of these words was unbearable, yet she bore it in silence, as all princesses were taught to do. In the solitude of her private chambers, she poured her grief into prayer. Kneeling before cold stone altars, she begged for strength, for forgiveness, for peace. She prayed for her lost children, for the chance that their souls had found gentleness in heaven. Even as their short lives had been harsh on earth, she prayed for patience with her husband, for the endurance to live a life that was hers in name only. Sometimes, when the castle was hushed in sleep, she would walk the echoing corridors alone, trailing her fingers along the stone walls. She imagined her children walking beside her, laughing, playing, filling the silence with joy that would never come. Other times, she sat by the window, staring into the night sky, seeking comfort in the constancy of the stars, reminders that there was a world beyond duty, beyond sorrow, beyond her narrow cage of existence. Her grief was invisible to most. At feasts, she smiled. At ceremonies, she bowed her head with grace. Courtiers praised her dignity, never knowing that behind her calm expression lay a storm of loss and loneliness. She was admired for her composure, but no one saw the cracks forming beneath it. In truth, the private sorrows of a medieval princess were perhaps her greatest burden. Wars, politics, alliances, these were struggles of kingdoms. But the pain of burying her children, of watching her husband's love drift elsewhere, of carrying grief in silence day after day, these were struggles of the soul. They could not be healed by crowns, nor silenced by duty. As the years unfolded and as the weight of sorrow pressed more heavily upon her heart, the princess turned increasingly toward the only constant that seemed unshakable in her world. Faith. For a woman of her time, religion was not merely a matter of belief, but the very structure of life itself. From the tolling of the bells at dawn, to the prayers whispered at dusk, the rhythms of the church ordered her days, offering both guidance and a fragile sense of peace in a life that often felt far beyond her control. In the chapel, with its cold stone walls and flickering candles, she found moments of quiet where no courtiers watched her, no husband judged her, and no whispers of politics reached her ears. The sound of hymns sung in Latin echoed in the vaulted ceilings, and she felt, if only for a few minutes, that she was simply a soul before God, rather than a pawn in the endless game of dynasties. Here she could kneel and pray for her children's health, for her husband's favor, for her family far away, but also silently, for her own heart to bear the burdens placed upon it. Religion, however, was more than personal comfort. It was duty. As a princess, her piety was constantly on display. Her prayers were meant to symbolize the devotion of her husband's realm, and her generosity to monasteries and convents was interpreted as proof of the crown's virtue. Even her moments of grief were expected to be framed through the lens of faith. When a child died, she was urged to accept it as God's will. When betrayal stung her, she was reminded to forgive as Christ forgave. Her private feelings mattered less than her public example, and so she wore the mask of holy obedience, even when her heart cracked beneath it. At times, she wondered if she truly believed as deeply as she was told to. Did God really listen to the whispered prayers of a lonely princess in the night? Did he see how she was used and discarded for political gain? These thoughts shamed her, yet they lingered. Faith gave her structure, but doubt gave her humanity. And so, she wove the two together, using prayer as both shield and sword, protection from despair, and the only tool she had to carve meaning out of a life not her own. Still, as her days grew heavier, she leaned into her devotions more than ever. She funded the poor. She paid for candles to burn in endless prayer. She listened to priests' sermons with quiet attention. In these acts, she found not joy exactly, but purpose. And in a life where so much had been chosen for her, purpose was the closest thing to freedom she could claim. Time, as it always does, proved to be the most relentless force in the princess's life. The girl once celebrated at birth, paraded as a bride, and anxiously watched for her fertility, slowly became a woman less spoken of, less needed, less seen, where once every step she took carried the weight of dynastic importance. Now her footsteps echoed quietly through corridors that no longer buzzed with whispers of her name. Her beauty, once remarked upon in every courtly greeting, was now mentioned only in past tense. The freshness of her face had given way to lines etched by years of worry, grief, and endless expectation. Her body, once pressured to carry heirs, was now considered spent, her womb no longer the source of kingdom's hopes. Younger brides had entered the scene, alliances forged with other princesses, their gowns glittering, their laughter light, their futures ripe with possibility. Where she had once stood as the symbol of promise, she now found herself in their shadow. Even her husband's eyes drifted elsewhere. If once he had courted her favor, even begrudgingly, he now turned his attention to newer consorts, mistresses, or perhaps even to a second marriage that could bring fresh political advantage. The princess, still bound by duty, was expected to endure this without complaint. Jealousy was unbecoming, grief was weakness, and silence was her role. And so she sat quietly in the hall, watching the younger women flit about, their faces full of the same hopes she had once carried, hopes she knew would, in time, harden into the same disappointments. Her influence in politics waned as well. Once she had been courted for her connections, her family abroad, her ability to bridge rival dynasties, her symbolic value as queen or consort. Now, younger voices carried more weight. Her words at council were no longer sought. Her advice, when offered, was politely ignored. A younger generation, her own children, sometimes even rivals among them, stepped into the spaces she had once occupied. She became, in essence, a relic of an earlier reign, respected perhaps in ceremony, but increasingly irrelevant in reality. The loneliness of this fading influence was sharper than the solitude of her childhood. Then, she had longed for friends, freedom, and simple joys. Now, she longed for remembrance. To be seen not as a fading woman tucked away in a cold castle chamber, but as the princess who had once carried nations' hopes on her shoulders. Yet, the world moves on swiftly, and she came to understand that power, beauty, and influence are borrowed things. They do not belong to a woman, not truly. They belong to the crown, the dynasty, the game of politics. Once her usefulness had ended, the game discarded her. Her daily life grew smaller. The great halls she once swept through were now replaced with private chambers. The voices that once sang her praises now spoke of others. The courtiers who had once flattered her now passed her by with only a bow of courtesy, their true ambitions attached to those younger and brighter in the eyes of power. And so, the princess who had once been everything to everyone became at last almost invisible. A quiet figure at the edge of the feast, a veiled woman in the chapel pew, a name still spoken in titles, but no longer in whispers of importance. She had been born into duty, raised for sacrifice, and shaped by expectation. But as her influence waned, she came to know a truth she had been shielded from as a child, that the life of a princess, far from being a fairy tale, was a fleeting performance on a stage where the actors were replaced as soon as their roles were complete. In the quiet twilight of her life, the princess found herself at last with something she had never truly possessed before: time. Time to sit, to think, to look back on the path that had stretched behind her like the long corridors of the castle. It was not the life of a fairy tale, no matter how many songs had been sung or stories written of princesses in shining gowns. It had been a life bound in duty, tethered by expectations, and shaped by decisions that were rarely her own. From the very moment of her birth, her fate had been sealed. She was celebrated not for who she was, but for what she could bring to others. An alliance, an heir, a link between kingdoms. As a child, her toys had been tutor's lessons. Her play confined within stone walls, her every word and gesture measured against an impossible standard. As a bride, she had been more transaction than woman, handed over to strangers in a foreign court. As a wife, she had endured suspicions, betrayals, and the relentless burden of producing children who might live long enough to carry on dynasties. And as age crept upon her, she had been slowly forgotten, her voice muted in halls where once it echoed with promise. Yet, within all this, she discovered something that no crown could give and no rival could take away. She discovered herself, quietly, in stolen moments. In the chapel, where her whispered prayers rose like smoke into the vaulted air. In the nursery, where she rocked her infants and let herself feel love without duty, if only for a breath. In gardens at dusk, where the fading light cast her not as a princess, not as a pawn, but simply as a woman, standing still beneath the open sky. Now, in her final years, she understood a truth that had taken a lifetime to reveal itself. She had lived a life that was never fully hers, and yet it was hers all the same. She had carried burdens with quiet dignity, given all that was asked of her, and endured more than anyone outside her chamber walls would ever truly know. She had been a daughter, a bride, a mother, a queen, and beneath it all, a soul that longed for gentleness, for freedom, for rest. And so, as the shadows lengthened and the great halls grew quiet, she let her mind drift across her memories, the bright silks of her childhood gowns, the sound of hooves as she left her home for marriage, the soft cries of her children, the endless chant of priests at the altar, the flicker of candlelight in the dark. These moments stitched together were the fabric of her life, not a fairy tale, no, but something more fragile, more human, and in its way, just as enduring. Now, as sleep came upon her like a soft cloak, she allowed herself to finally let go of duty, of expectation, of the endless weight of being a princess. For once, she could simply rest. No crown upon her head, no watchful eyes upon her shoulders, only peace and silence, and the gentle knowledge that her story, though heavy, had been lived fully. And so, good night, dear listener. May your sleep be softer than hers ever was. May your dreams be kinder, and may you drift away now. Oh, knowing that history's princesses were not fairy tales, but women, just like us, who longed for comfort in the end. Good night.